A world engulfed in flames, the outbreak of World War I. The year 1914 dawned with Europe on the precipice of disaster. A complex web of alliances and rivalries set the stage for war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited the powder keg. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. A chain reaction of alliances swiftly followed. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Great Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, much of Europe was at war. The Central Powers faced the Allied powers. The United States joined in 1917. World War I had begun, reshaping the 20th century. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's gamble for a swift victory. At the heart of Germany's initial war strategy lay the Schlieffen Plan, a bold, albeit flawed plan conceived years earlier. It aimed to bypass France's defenses by advancing through Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was to quickly defeat France before Russia could mobilize. The plan relied on speed and precision. However, Belgian resistance delayed the German advance. The French and British forces mounted a strong defense. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan had profound consequences. It condemned Germany to a prolonged two-front war. The Western Front descended into a bloody stalemate. The Schlieffen Plan's failure had lasting repercussions. Stalemate and attrition. The Western Front's grinding war. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan ushered in a new and brutal phase of the war, characterized by static trench warfare along the Western Front. Both sides dug in, creating elaborate trench systems stretching for hundreds of miles across Belgium and France. These trenches, defended by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery, became the defining feature of the Western Front, a landscape of mud, blood, and misery. The war of attrition that ensued was unlike anything previously witnessed in modern warfare. Attacks were often met with devastating machine gun fire, mowing down waves of soldiers charging across no man's land, the desolate expanse of land between opposing trenches. Artillery bombardments, while intended to soften enemy defenses, often inflicted heavy casualties on both sides, transforming the landscape into a cratered wasteland. Life in the trenches was a grim and perilous existence. Soldiers endured constant shelling, the threat of sniper fire, and the psychological strain of living under such horrific conditions. Disease was rampant, and trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and unsanitary conditions, was a constant threat. The stalemate on the Western Front exacted a heavy toll on the morale of both sides, but it was a stalemate that would persist for years, claiming millions of lives in a series of bloody and indecisive battles. The economic vice, blockades, and resource depletion. While the battle lines on the Western Front remained largely static, a different kind of war was being waged at sea and within the heart of the warring nations. The Allied naval blockade of Germany, enforced by the superior British Navy, gradually tightened its grip, strangling the German economy and depriving its war machine of vital resources. Germany, heavily reliant on imports for raw materials such as food, oil, and rubber, found itself increasingly isolated. The blockade led to widespread shortages, forcing the German government to implement rationing and other wartime measures. The civilian population, facing food shortages and economic hardship, grew increasingly war-weary. The economic strain of the war took a heavy toll on Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. Factories struggled to produce weapons and ammunition due to shortages of raw materials. The German mark, the national currency, plummeted in value, fueling inflation and further eroding morale. The Allied blockade, while a slow and agonizing form of warfare, proved to be a decisive factor in Germany's eventual defeat. Section 5. Allied Innovations and Strategies, Turning the Tide. While the early years of World War I were marked by stalemate and horrific losses, the Allied powers gradually began to gain the upper hand, thanks in part to key innovations and strategic adaptations. The development of new technologies, such as the tank, the airplane, and improved artillery tactics, began to break the deadlock of trench warfare. The tank, first deployed by the British in 1916, offered a potential solution to the stalemate of trench warfare. Although early tanks were slow and unreliable, their ability to cross trenches and withstand machine gun fire made them a formidable weapon. The airplane, initially used primarily for reconnaissance, evolved into a weapon of war, used for bombing raids and aerial combat. Allied strategic thinking also evolved. The costly and indecisive battles of the early war, such as the Battle of the Somme, led to a re-evaluation of offensive tactics. The Allies, recognizing the futility of large-scale frontal assaults against fortified positions, began to adopt new strategies, such as the creeping barrage, which involved coordinating artillery fire with infantry advances. These innovations, combined with the growing economic strain on Germany, began to tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies. Section 6. Internal unrest, social and political tensions in war-torn Germany. As the war dragged on and the Allied blockade tightened its grip, Germany began to experience growing internal unrest. The social and political fabric of the nation, already strained by the demands of total war, began to fray under the pressure of economic hardship, political divisions, and war weariness. Food shortages, exacerbated by the British naval blockade, led to widespread malnutrition and social unrest. The German government's attempts to ration food and other essential goods were met with growing discontent. Labor strikes, fueled by declining living standards and the demands of wartime production, disrupted the war effort. Political divisions also widened. The German government, dominated by the military leadership, faced growing criticism from the Reichstag, the German parliament. The Social Democratic Party, once a staunch supporter of the war effort, became increasingly vocal in its opposition to the war. The growing internal unrest within Germany, coupled with the deteriorating military situation, signaled that the war was reaching a breaking point. Section 7. The collapse of the Central Powers, a cascade of defeats. By 1918, the tide of the war had decisively turned against the Central Powers. The entry of the United States into the war on the side of the Allies in 1917 provided a much-needed boost to Allied morale and manpower. The American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing, arrived in France, bringing with it fresh troops and resources. A series of Allied offensives in 1918, bolstered by American troops and supported by new technologies and tactics, broke the stalemate on the Western Front. German forces, exhausted and demoralized after years of war, began to crumble. The Allied advance proved unstoppable. Meanwhile, the other members of the Central Powers were also facing defeat. The Ottoman Empire, after a series of defeats in the Middle East, surrendered to the Allies in October 1918. Austria-Hungary, racked by internal strife and facing military collapse, signed an armistice with the Allies on November 4, 1918. Germany, isolated and facing imminent defeat, had little choice but to seek an end to the fighting. Section 8. The Armistice and its aftermath. Germany accepts defeat. With the collapse of the Central Powers, Germany found itself isolated and facing certain defeat. The German leadership, recognizing the futility of further resistance, sought an armistice with the Allies. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent on the Western Front. The armistice, signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France, marked the end of World War I. The terms of the armistice were dictated by the victors. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause that would become a source of bitterness and resentment in Germany in the years to come. Germany was also required to disarm, cede territory, and pay heavy reparations to the Allied powers. The armistice brought to an end the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. Millions lay dead, empires had crumbled, and Europe lay in ruins. The war had profound consequences for Germany, shattering its economy, its military, and its sense of national pride. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, would formally end the war, but it would also sow the seeds of future conflict. Section 9. A World Reshaped. The Enduring Legacy of Germany's Loss. The defeat of Germany in World War I had far-reaching consequences that reverberated throughout the 20th century. The war reshaped the map of Europe, leading to the creation of new nations and the redrawing of old borders. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian empires, once major powers, collapsed, swept away by the tide of revolution and war. The Treaty of Versailles, while intended to ensure a lasting peace, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including crippling reparations payments and the loss of territory. The treaty, widely perceived as unjust in Germany, fostered resentment and nationalist sentiment, creating fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies in the years to come. World War I marked a turning point in history. It shattered the illusion of progress and enlightenment that had characterized the pre-war era. The war's unprecedented scale of death and destruction left an enduring legacy of trauma and disillusionment. The conflict also sowed the seeds of future conflicts, including World War II, which would erupt just 2 decades later. The world that emerged from the ashes of World War I was a world forever changed, a world grappling with the consequences of a war that had shattered the old order and ushered in an uncertain future.